Have you ever woken up without an enemy? If you have, then you are fully equipped to appreciate the beauty of the drama of Eastern and Western Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you haven't, that's not necessarily a problem. You will still learn a lot from this video, probably a new emotion even. So, in the late December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it collapsed the conflict. It wasn't just a military conflict, of course, it was a Cold War, and so much the better. It was an ideological conflict. And imagine now what happens when something that gave meaning to your entire life, that illuminated your entire sense of self, what now they fashionably call identity, has collapsed. That there are no longer notions, clear notions of good and evil. There's no sense of purpose. There is no meaning. And that conflict has persisted, that with all its meanings, persisted for no less than 2 generations. What is to be done? Not many people thought about this, but that situation of radical change is a situation pregnant with the risks. In tarot cards, that may or may not be familiar to you, that system has a particular card called Death. It's a card number 13 in the major arcana. For anyone who is not familiar with the system and the meaning of that card, it's a scary card, effectively. It's often drawn as a skeleton. In actual fact, that card has nothing to do with death. What it signifies is major transformation, radical transition from one situation to another. And folded within this, and there's an idea that this situation can be likened to death. Something died, something new is going to be born. That something is highly uncertain. And the situation is such that the societies or personalities go through some sort of a liminal period, where old rules no longer apply, but new rules are not in existence as yet. That is precisely what happened in Eastern and Western Europe at the time. Eastern Europe simply took that death card out of the deck. Now, I would share with you a memory. Many moons ago, I collaborated on a project with the Institute of Public Health in Cambridge, and project coordinators invited, as an enrichment really, seminar, several major personalities in the British civil service, National Health Service, and such like, to talk to us about the epidemiology of British community, really, British population. One very memorable figure that came to visit us as part of this seminar series was a senior officer in the British prison service. It was an Asian gentleman. He came uniformed, and there was something arresting about him. He gave us a short biographical note explaining how he came to be in the prison service, and became clear very quickly that for him it was a second life. His first life, 30 or more years, was spent in the British Army. And he described his transition to the prison service in the following way. He said, and I remember it vividly, "One day I woke up, and I woke up without an enemy." He related to that fateful late December, 26th, 27th of December 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. This was the report of the British officer. Luckily for him, he was close to retirement at that time, and also the path to the prison service was clear to him, that his skills were transferable. So for him, the transition from the old to the new was smooth somehow by that. Hundreds, thousands of officers on both sides of the dividing line, Eastern and Western Europe, simply didn't have that. And in actual fact, there are documented cases of suicides of Soviet officers who they left several suicide notes, as people tend to do in these moments, for the family, for the friends, and for the society, and where they stated very clearly that life is no longer possible for them in a situation where the entire system of meaning to which they dedicated their lives collapsed in front of their eyes. They saw no sense at all in continuing living, as tragic as it sounds. I would add, on an aside, that the Russian army at the time probably was in the most dire condition. That is because although the society was in a state of crisis, but at least the society could be resuscitated by the beginnings of the private market that took upon itself functions that the state played before. With the structures such as the army, that simply couldn't happen. Armies squarely depend on the capacities of the state. The state was collapsing, underperforming. The private sector could not help much. And so the soldiers and the officers could not even be trained. They didn't even have equipment. They didn't have bullets. Some of them were some military units were hired by the newly emerging private sector as workers, as available labor force. It was a disaster all along. So that is the meaning of that's what happened in Eastern Europe at that time. Now, there was another insight that officer shared with us, and it stayed with me, and I think it's appropriate to share it with you as well. He talked to us quite a bit about epidemiology of the prison population, and one thing that he highlighted was the reality, misinterpreted, misunderstood, misconstrued reality of what is called home visits for the prisoners. There is a routine of home visits for different prisoners. Of course, the implementation of that depends on the nature of the crime, on the behavior of the convict, etc. But many of them have home visits, and these home visits are not understood adequately by the general population. They're perceived as a sort of attempt of the system to indulge the prisoner. In actual fact, the whole system of the visits has been developed with something completely different in mind, and that something is the reduction in reoffending. The prison system understands and anticipates that at some point the prisoner will serve his or her time, and at that point they will go back to the community they came from. Having been separated from it for several years, they're not expected to have any meaningful connections within that community, and so their return will only mean that reoffending is pretty much on the cards. By providing home visits, the prison service creates the situation, or at least attempts to create a situation, where the prisoner remains embedded in the community throughout their time. And so when they go back to something, some sort of system that will support them then. Thereby, we're hoping reducing the risk of reoffending. In other words, there is a prophylactic action that is rooted in understanding of those post-release realities, and there is explicit acknowledgement that aftercare is needed in this situation where the radical transition is made from the theoretically unwelcome situation of imprisonment to theoretically welcome situation of freedom. That freedom for that individual who has been shaped by the forces of imprisonment for so many years, that this situation is, the situation of freedom, is also pregnant with the risks. I have studied voluminous materials in the history of the Cold War and the Soviet collapse and the post-collapse reality, and I'm pretty sure that nobody have thought about the transition from one system to another in those terms. Identifying those risks, that aftercare was appropriate in that situation. Indeed, one of the very senior American diplomats, Dan Fried, said that the authors of the American security architecture in Europe, as he called it, never anticipated that the world of conflict will collapse. They operated as if the systems that they were building will operate in eternity. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not anticipated broadly but it's something that certain specialists, Sovietologists, and demographers, in actual fact, were talking about. Yet, it hasn't made a mark, let's say, certainly not on American diplomacy as far as I can see it. Why to talk about this in the introduction to the Defeat of the West, which is Emmanuel Todd's new book, which I will be reviewing here? It is clear to me that a reader that would want to appreciate a book needs that introduction. The preface of Emmanuel Todd starts with paraphrasing some ideas from a speech that the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, gave on the day of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the 24th of February 2022. And that's the right thing to do. It's a document. And I can see that Emmanuel Todd works carefully with the documents, as he should, being a historian. That, however, as a technique, choosing this date to start the story is too late. In my view, what needs to be understood before the book is appreciated is the history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and now completely forgotten history of its counterweight in Eastern Europe, the Warsaw Pact. Both structures were born in the late 40s and the beginning of the 50s. Both structures are symbolic of the Cold War. The logic behind their creation, their history, need to be understood. One of them collapsed 6 months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a defensive alliance of Eastern European communist and socialist countries. It's almost natural to anticipate that would happen. Yes, so the Soviet power collapsed, and so all of its sponsored structures are expected to go as well, and they did. NATO, however, remained. It remained in a world that is theoretically now was free of conflict. What was the purpose of that organization? How did it see its own role in the new conflict-free Europe? This is something that I'm going to examine in this video.